So economists often make predictions, and a lot of those predictions are on topics that are pretty uncomfortable. Sometimes we come out with statements that aren't very pleasant, and a lot of the time I hope that my predictions are wrong, just because the things that I foresee are pretty disastrous, ugly, and on the whole not pleasant for anyone. And this what I'm going to talk about in this video is all of those things. It's not pleasant, it's uncomfortable, and I hope that I'm wrong, but I'll lay out sort of the incentive structures that I see, and you can make up your own decisions, and time will tell. Um, I hope that I'm wrong. That's kind of the first thing that I'd like to say, but I'll talk about two sort of things that have happened recently, and then how I see that playing into something else potentially in the future, along with some signals that we're already seeing for that movement. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is with regards to Russia and Ukraine. We recently saw Ukraine successfully make some attacks on the wild berry facilities. This is Russia's version of Amazon. So they initially started with, I believe it was 4 warehouses were hit and pretty much completely destroyed. That attack was very successful, and they've ramped that up. And the reason this type of an attack is really significant in a change is because of who it actually affects. So when you have a war, different demographics feel the consequence of the conflict differently. In the case of Russia, men were feeling the consequences of the conflict at a disproportionately greater effect than the women in Russia. And the reason being is men are called for the military draft. That is obviously that is unfree labor. You have no right to refuse. In that, obviously, there's ways to get around it, but still, that is felt by the men, not the women of Russia. On top of that, you actually have a benefit for the women in Russia in the sense that there are men being taken out of the labor market, which then actually increases your sort of wage price on the supply side of things. Um, I'm not saying that the war is beneficial to women. That's not my statement here. I'm just saying that it is affecting the demographics differently, and we need to be pretty pragmatic about the actual effects of it. Then on top of that, you also have this other sort of interesting mechanism, which is that for some women, it has become a financial benefit, this conflict at least, because they are marrying soldiers specifically, so that when the soldier dies, they get the death benefit, and they're using that as a deposit for a house. So this was kind of even sort of laughed and joked about on a Russian financial it was like a podcast where you had a real estate agent saying to women, if you need a deposit for a house, marry a younger man who is a soldier in the army and hope that he dies. And then they sort of laughed and joked about it. Since they've made an apology statement for it, and I'm not saying that that is the financial sort of escape, the way that you get the Russian dream, so to speak. That's not what the statement I'm saying is. All I'm saying is that it is affecting demographics differently. And these are two of the benefits that women are getting that the men are obviously not. So what has that got to do with the wild berries attack? Wildberries is very similar to Amazon. Okay, so they do B2B business, so businesses selling to other businesses. On top of that, they also do B2C businesses, which is, you're a household and you're buying goods from Amazon, your consumption goods, whatever it is. When it comes to the demographic difference, women are better consumers when it comes to B2C. They purchase more frequently and their total spending is actually greater. Men, on average, purchase less frequently, but they have a higher average unit price. But their overall spending is actually less than women. So in destroying these facilities, you actually have that impacting the standard of living for women more so than for men, because that is just the way that it is. Now, Ukraine is attacking these facilities because they're saying that these facilities are being used to distribute military goods. That's their legitimacy for attacking this type of infrastructure, and they're going ahead with it, and they are attacking it very successfully. There's an interesting modern sort of mechanism with regards to these warehouse facilities, in that a lot of these B2C sales come from the influencer affiliate pipeline. And what that means in real terms is when a facility is destroyed, the goods are destroyed, the customers get delays and they can't get a refund, they're annoyed, they then pressure the funnel, sort of the marketing node, which is the individual influencer who has a relationship with the audience. So when you actually have a strike happen, goods not delivered, the influencer then communicates the distress. There's been videos of a lot of these influencers sort of crying that their merchandising has been destroyed, and that is actually sort of garnering sympathy of a demographic that was not necessarily feeling the repercussions of the conflict as much as another demographic. So that, in terms of the political cost, it is raising the political cost of the war, not just the economic cost, because you have now more demographics getting annoyed at this conflict because of the effect it's having on their life. Okay. So there's two takeaways that I want you to sort of have for this, which is two takeaways I'm taking from this. Firstly, is actually that this as a tactic, if it is successful, which it looks like it is being successful, it will soon be mimicked by other countries that are engaging in conflict. So be prepared to see this happening more frequently across the world. That's one thing. The other thing is that it is actually ramping up not just the economic cost of the war for Russia, but on top of that, the political cost of the war for Russia. Now, we're going to park what's happened with wild berries, Ukraine and Russia, to the side for one moment, and we're going to talk about what's been happening in Asia very recently during the same time period with regards to Japan. Now, for those of you that do not know, Japan has been having a bit of a currency crisis as a result of them increasing their yields, having to pay off a lot of debt. The yen has actually been in a bit of a free fall. It's had a bailout since, and I'll talk about that in a little while. But one thing that's quite important with regards to Japan is they've been raising their short-term interest rates for the first time in a very, very long period. A very, very long period. They used to have negative interest rates. Can you believe it? The insanity. And the one thing that a lot of people have missed is the fact that you can actually raise interest rates, but if you have so much debt, raising the interest rates can actually be inflationary. Sounds, like a paradox. The reason being is it completely depends on how much of your government spending is going to be on the interest of debt. So if your deficits, meaning the difference between your tax revenue and your government spending, if your deficits are increasing because the interest on your debt is growing at a greater rate than you can bring in your tax revenue, you can actually increase inflation whilst increasing the interest rate. And that's an absolute crisis ready to unfold. So there's a lot of risk with Japan for that. I think it's 25 to 30% of their government spending is on interest on debt, and that's a greater portion of the tax revenue that they make. I forget the exact numbers. I want to say it's like 35 to 40%, which is a really, really sort of problematic amount. To be fair to Japan, their government spending as a proportion of GDP is actually not too bad. It's just the volume of their debt relative to how much tax revenue they actually bring in. That is a very uncomfortable, a very, very uncomfortable level. And the volume of debt they have relative to their GDP is quite insane. It's around 230%. So anyway, you have a situation where the yen was in a bit of a free fall. What they started to do was they started to sell US treasuries, so US debt, in order to prop up and strengthen their yen, their currency. Now, this puts a lot of pressure on the Americans, on the US, because if Japan starts selling their treasuries onto the open market, the yields on US bonds begins to rise, and that then puts a lot of pressure on the stock market, puts a lot of pressure on the US central bank. All in all, it's not a very nice picture from the American perspective. So what did the Americans do? They started helping Japan. They first started doing that by selling euros, which does harm the Europeans, but they're selling euros in exchange for yen to strengthen that yen to then protect themselves from the rising yields. But they then created an emergency protocol where, and it's a very clever thing, but it's not a smart thing, where what they did was they said to the Bank of Japan, you promise us the treasuries, pledge the US treasuries, do not sell them on the open market, pledge them to us, and what we'll do is we will print dollars, give them to you for a short period of time, for 30 days, instead of you selling them. And in 30 days' time, you then buy back the treasuries. So they don't get sold. We'll give you dollars, we'll print the dollars, and the balance sheets actually increase, which is quite amusing. It's effectively it's quantitative easing, not to bail out the Americans, to bail out the Japanese. So that's the structure that they've done. One thing that I find slightly like not interesting, but slightly infuriating, is if the Japanese can't pay for it now, what makes them in a position to be able to pay for it in 30 days? It looks like this temporary solution will be a perpetual, um, the new status quo. I don't see a situation where they'll just stop. If the yen gets to, if $1 becomes 165 yen again, they'll have to keep doing this. It doesn't seem like a very sustainable strategy. Now, why am I linking this with regards to Russia? Is that this really, really highlights a pressure point for both the Japanese, but mainly for the US, in the sense that they are now effectively bound to bailing out the Japanese. For context, the US has a similar, very, very different arrangement that is still being negotiated with the UAE in the Middle East to also prop up the dollar peg that they have going on there. It's a different financial mechanism completely, but still, you do have the US taking measures in the Middle East and also in Japan to simultaneously try and cover so that they can maintain that dollar hegemony, which is kind of under threat. And the reason this is so important for the US to do is when it comes to the Trump administration, one of their last remaining demographics that is in support of them is the asset holder. Okay, they've lost a lot of white working class support because of this conflict. Even before the conflict in the Middle East, they were losing support because living standards were deteriorating and the job opportunities have not been good. You've got the non-farm payrolls that keeps coming out that's suggesting jobs growth. But if you look at the growth where it actually is, it's generally in health and social assistance, which is not in itself technically a purely natural private sector job because of the amount of spending on Medicare and Medicaid. You've got 2 trillion in Medicare and Medicaid spending, which props up those sectors. And I think, I forget the exact number, but if you look at the jobs reports and you look at them as a sector breakdown, the thing that has been bulking it up has been this Medicare, Medicaid. So when it comes to actual voters, they can feel that. They're aware of that. They may not, there's such a difference between what the official headline figure is and what the sentiment on the ground is. There's a huge divergence there. And the individual worker is very aware of that. So now, when it comes to Russia, they are being hit economically and there's a big political cost. The troubling thing, and I don't want to sound like an alarmist, and I'm also not saying that something's going to happen like right this very second and it's going to be dramatic and it's going to be crazy. I'm not saying that, but what I am saying is now that there is this pressure point when it comes to Japan, there is such an incentive for foul play to occur. All they need to do is increase the amount of government spending, decrease the amount of tax revenue, or increase the inflationary pressures for Japan that would cause them to actually increase their interest rates at a faster rate. These are all not very beneficial things and things to very much watch out for. And the reason I decided to actually record this video is I'm already seeing signals that something in Asia may actually be occurring. One of the reasons that this is also is going to be seen as an opportunity is a lot of military assets were removed from Asia Pacific to the Middle East, making Asia weaker, Asia Pacific, East Asia, a lot weaker, which will create this incentive structure. Now, we've seen Putin decide to travel to Kuril, which is a Russian territory right next to Japan. It's on the north of the islands there. Russia has a lot of territories there. He's gone there. The Japanese have viewed this as actually a little bit of an aggressive symbol because he's also on the same trip gone to North Korea to celebrate North Korean Liberation Day, which is liberation from the Japanese. Now, for quite a while ago, I would say that there's a few conflicts that we're most likely going to see, and that was Venezuela, Lebanon, Iran, Poland, North and South Korea. I didn't say Japan. However, now that's kind of on my periphery. In what capacity I'm still trying to determine for myself. But all of those conflicts are ones that I can see happening before a China-Taiwan conflict. The incentives are there. The only ones that we haven't seen so far is Poland, North and South Korea, and those ones, as time moves on, look like they're approaching closer and closer. And there's a few things with regards to North Korea. With regards to the alliance of Russia, Iran, um, China, and North Korea. I always just refer to it as the Mongolian Empire because it's basically the same landmass. And then also, once Genghis Khan died, it fractured in the fall, which is basically the same if you get rid of Central Asia. Um, so we kind of see that happening at the moment. But one thing I found quite interesting, because it leans on the sort of communication styles of these countries and also their leaders, is you had a border incident recently with the North Koreans and the South Koreans, which isn't something that's necessarily rare, but having it on the same week that the North Koreans were also firing missiles as tests towards Japan, and also at the same time Putin's around, and he's also going to the Japanese islands. Um, what Trump decided to do was he scaled back these military exercises that the US was doing with South Korea as an attempt to kind of curry favor and show sort of good relations with North Korea. But the thing is Trump and Kim Jong Un are quite similar in character in the sense that they're very sort of headstrong. And that type of a character is one where they appreciate when people, curry favor, show respect. However, um, if what they want goes against the individual trying to curry favor, they're not necessarily one to sort of back away from it. So I don't necessarily think that reducing the military exercises will be anything sort of meaningful. It doesn't really strike me as something that will uh, be a decider if it is in North Korea's interests to pursue any action on Japan or on South Korea. I don't think sort of uh, uh, international relation flattery will prevent that, because like the Iranians and the Russians communicate very very differently to the Americans. Like with the Russians, they'll say exactly what it is that they want, and then they will sort of prepare for it, and then just before the moment of doing it, they'll just lie, and then they'll do it. Um, with the Iranians, they'll tell you like 500 times what it is that they want, what it is that they will do, and then they will do it. And then with the Americans, is they'll kind of tell you what they want, they kind of will tell you what they will do, and then they kind of ping pong back and forth between a bunch of different things, and then they do whatever it is they like because they have so much power. It's just a very different communication style. So, look, just to round it off and just not to beat around the bush, I'm not trying to be very sensationalist, but I am saying that I'm paying a lot of attention to what will happen and what the developments will be surrounding Japan, surrounding South Korea. Will there be any foul play from either the North Koreans or even the Russians themselves? I've already structured a portfolio in order to hedge myself against any eventuality that will occur in the way that I think it may. Um, if you find these types of topics interesting, feel free to join the school community. If you're in the financial services industry and you want consulting on these types of topics and where I'm looking, then also feel free to message on the school community. I try and respond every single day to individuals. That's the best way to reach me. Um, and again, I wouldn't run around saying, the world's on fire, the world's on fire. But at the same time, these things are gradual and then they have such a big impact. I don't like being caught with my trousers down. I don't want you to be caught with your trousers down. Be aware that these developments are occurring. Be aware that there are incentives for this type of structure. If the US decides it will pursue quantitative easing to defend Japan because of the economic consequence and the political cost that that will have, especially approaching these midterm elections, it creates a huge incentive for an adversary that has faced economic consequences and an increase in the political cost. That creates a picture. The incentive structure is there. I then have to monitor that, and I would urge you to also monitor it. So, on that incredibly cheery note, feel free to send a message, and yeah, follow along for more of these types of videos and insights. Every week we have a market update call where we go through these types of topics and more on a weekly basis in a lot more detail. There's a Q&A element to it as well. But I've not really used YouTube before, so I'm quite new to the whole platform. Anyway, I hope you have a great day and take care.